Support comes from St. Louis Public Library Foundation, helping the library serve children and their families with programs and services needed to become lifelong readers. More information about the foundation is at slpl.org.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Alex Hoyer, in for Elaine Cha. The St. Louis Cardinals have a storied history that includes 11 World Series titles, and despite the organization's struggles in recent years, the Cardinals are one of the most successful and beloved teams in all of baseball. There are also plenty of Cardinals players in the Baseball Hall of Fame, and that includes prominent black ball players such as Ozzie Smith, Lou Brock, and Bob Gibson. Today's interview is not about any of those players. In fact, it's about a player who's a footnote in Cardinals history, an unfortunate footnote. Charlie Peete was a black ball player from Portsmouth, Virginia, who at the age of 27 in 1956 got his call up to the major leagues. He played in 23 games and batted just .192 for the Cardinals before he was demoted. But Charlie Peete was a great ball player. He'd won a minor league batting title and was a top prospect for the St. Louis Cardinals. He was expected to compete heavily for the starting center field job in 1957. But Pete's life was cut short when he, his wife, and 3 children died in a plane crash when Peete was on his way to play winter ball in Venezuela. Joining me now to talk about Charlie Peete is Danny Spewak. Danny is a St. Louis native, a Mizzou grad, and now a television journalist in the Twin Cities. He's the author of the new book, Cardinal Dreams, The Legacy of Charlie Peete, and A Life Cut Short. Danny Spewak, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Alex, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Charlie Peete was not a name that I knew until I came across your book. How did he first come to your attention?
You know, that's a really good question. Growing up as a huge Cardinals fan, I also wasn't familiar with the name. It's just not a name or a player that is really talked about, you know, even as you mentioned with the storied history of the franchise. Kind of a forgotten name. And it first came on my radar in 2014 after the death of Oscar Taveras. If Cardinals fans remember, a budding outfield prospect, a really great young player, was killed in a really unfortunate automobile accident at a really young age. And that reawakened some stories of Charlie Peete in St. Louis because Peete had a very similar story. A top prospect in 1956 who tragically lost his life in a commercial plane crash with the rest of his family, traveling to a winter baseball league in Venezuela in the offseason. He was expected to be a great player for the Cardinals in the 1950s. And, you know, it always kind of sat there. I didn't know a ton beyond just hearing the name. But as I, began my writing career and was looking for book subjects, the name Charlie Peete just continued to stick with me, and I felt that there'd been some coverage of his story and of his life story and his accomplishments and what could have been if not for the accident. But I felt that a real book was there and a real chance to dive in depth about the kind of person he was and his accomplishments and the legacy that he left, and that's how the book project started.
Yeah, and let's get to Charlie Peete. I want to start with his early life and then get into his career that eventually becomes a call-up with the St. Louis Cardinals. But I want to start by reading a quote that you include in the book from a Cardinals pitcher named Brooks Lawrence. Lawrence, like Peete, was black, and in 1954 he was quoted as saying, "The whole time I lived in St. Louis, I didn't go downtown more than twice. There wasn't anything downtown for me. They wouldn't let me in the restaurants, wouldn't let me in any public places." And he goes on to say that he was invited to an end-of-season party at the Chase Hotel in 1954, and he said, quote, "Only thing was, I knew I couldn't go." Now, I wanted to read that Brooks Lawrence quote to highlight that segregation and racism were very real issues for Charlie Peete as he grew up, but also as he made his way through baseball. I think that it's important to have that backdrop to our conversation. With that backdrop, what was Charlie Peete's childhood like?
He was born in Virginia, the Tidewater area of Virginia. If anybody's ever been out in that part of the country, he was born in a small town, Franklin. This is southeastern Virginia, so we're talking like the Norfolk area. Portsmouth, Virginia, was his hometown, so it's across the river there from Norfolk, Virginia, kind of Virginia Beach area, just to give our listeners a little bit of a context of the area he was from. And so he was born in 1929 and lived, grew up during the Depression in segregated Virginia. because he died so early, it's difficult to kind of glean some of his experiences, because he never grew old enough to be able to retell those experiences. I mean, he died at the age of 27, so there's a lot missing from his own words. But we can fill in from some of the interviews I did with some of his old-time friends and coaches who are still around. A 97-year-old coach at his high school in Portsmouth, Virginia, really helped fill in the gaps about who Peete was. When I was able to travel there, I was able to see his old neighborhood and where he would have lived. So he grew up in Portsmouth, Virginia, for the most part, and was from a working class family. His parents were both working class folk, and they were hardworking, and the rest of the neighborhood was very tight knit. And he really gravitated toward an athletic career. He went to a very historic African American high school, I.C. Norcom High School in Portsmouth, Virginia, which is still there today. A lot of pride in Norcom, and he's wasn't a graduate, but a proud attendee of that school, is still talked about there in that part of the country. And he didn't graduate because he decided to pursue semi-pro baseball. He was a terrific athlete. They actually called him Pistol Pete, was his nickname, and that was before Pete Maravich. So I think he was maybe the original with that. But yes, it was a difficult upbringing, by all accounts, because segregation impacted every part of daily life at that time in Virginia, and there was a minor league baseball team in town in the 40s. That was an all-white team. It was kind of a Class B, as you would call it, minor league that operated out of Portsmouth, Virginia. The league had some affiliates with some major league teams, and Peete, if he went to the games, he grew up across the street from Portsmouth Stadium, but when he went to minor league baseball games, he had to sit in segregated sections, so it really impacted every part of his life. But when he emerged on the African American semi-pro circuit in the segregated semi-pro leagues, he really made a name for himself, began to travel a little bit, and that was how he put himself on the map as an athlete.
You said he was a terrific athlete. Do we know why he gravitated to baseball?
That's a really good question. He played a little bit of football based on talking with one of his coaches at his high school. He loved football, and the thing about him is he was a really gritty kind of player. He's a very good athlete, and was kind of a tough player. He was able to withstand hits when he was playing football, and he was bigger. He was very muscular, but he gravitated towards baseball. I think just because, it may have been his better sport, according to talking to his coach. It was just what he excelled at, and he was really versatile. He played every position. Just loved the game, and that was his true passion, is the way it was described to me. And so although he was very good at football and surely could have played other sports, baseball was just kind of what drew him in. And of course, at that time, baseball was just huge. And you're talking about, he comes of age at a time when Jackie Robinson enters the league with Brooklyn in 1947. That's around when Peete starts his semi-pro career. And so he had tried out for the Brooklyn Dodgers at one point. Jackie Robinson was an inspiration to so many across the country, including Peete. He didn't make it. He didn't get right to the major league system at that time, but just speaks a little bit to some of his dreams and aspirations as a young man.
Peete began his professional baseball career in the Negro Leagues. What was that experience like for him?
Well, he played for a team known as the Indianapolis Clowns. They were not based in Indianapolis, but they were a traveling team that was very famous at the time. A lot of really great players. Hank Aaron played for the Indianapolis Clowns about a year after Peete left. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of an inkling of the talent level of who exactly was playing at that time. It was in the league known as the Negro American League, which the Society for American Baseball Research recently classified as a major league. There were some really good players in the league. Ernie Banks, Elston Howard were playing for the Kansas City Monarchs at that time. So several baseball Hall of Famers that Peete was competing against. Now, Peete was very young. It was his first time playing as a professional, and so he didn't get a lot of playing time, and he didn't particularly play that well, but he was exposed to this new world of professional baseball that was very high level, and after a couple of months playing with the Clowns, batting sparingly, playing maybe as a pinch hitter or, playing a little bit of outfield or even some other infield positions at times, he ended up going up to Western Canada, where a lot of African-American players flocked to during the 50s because the climate was so much better up in Canada. They just had so much more freedom to move around outside of the Jim Crow era of the U.S., and played in a really good league in Western Canada and continued his professional career in that regard.
You mentioned his time with the Indianapolis Clowns, about how it was a traveling team. Talk a little bit more about what that kind of pace of play and that travel schedule was like as they played around the country?
It was a grueling itinerary, and you're talking especially as they're traveling through the southern U.S. They can't stay in most hotels, and a lot of times they were staying in people's houses, wherever they could find, and so it was difficult. They weren't allowed to eat at most of the restaurants, even use the bathroom. So you're talking them traveling, 15, 20-hour bus trips through the South in the early 50s, and they're playing sometimes like 2 games a day. They're playing everywhere. One day you look at the newspaper archives, which is how I kind of pieced together the season. One day they're playing in Tennessee, the next day they're playing in Alabama. It's just they had a regular league schedule that they played, but they also played a lot of exhibitions. It was a lot of the way that the club made a lot of their money. And able to pay the players' salaries and things like that. And they were very popular, enormously popular, and a very good team. They were known kind of like the Harlem Globetrotters of baseball at that time. They had a lot of different events and things that they would do during the game, but they were a really good baseball team as well. And they mixed entertainment with sport, and that was a really kind of a unique experience for Peete.
Like many ball players, when America was at war, their career was interrupted by war, and Charlie Peete was drafted into the Army in 1952 and served in the Special Services Division for, I think, a little over a year.
Yes, and it's so interesting. Just a weird St. Louis connection. As many know, the National Archives had a fire in the 70s that destroyed a lot of the Korean War records.
Yes,
that was included in Pete's. When I tried to find his records in the National Archives, they told me basically we have like one document, and that's it. So it's really difficult to figure out exactly where he went. And the tragedy, of course, is that because his wife and his children were killed in that plane crash in 1956. There's very few people who really have direct knowledge of where he would have been in the war, people that he would have told, and enough time has passed. So that was difficult to piece together, but it does appear he was both on U.S. bases in Korea and Japan, and played a lot of baseball, actually. There was, of course, a division where there was a lot of athletics being going on the bases. And he had said at one point in his career that he felt he really became a great baseball player actually playing in the Army. He was exposed to a lot of really good athletes there in the military. And that was when he said he found his hitch, I think was the quote that he gave at one point. So we don't know if he was in direct combat or what exactly he was doing in Korea, because those stories have been lost to time. But we know it was a successful experience for him.
Yeah, and by chance, that National Archives fire, was it his discharge paperwork that you found? Because I know that sometimes that was the only paperwork that existed.
Yes, exactly. That was the only one they had. It was one page, and it was really hard to see too. It was like kind of an old grainy photocopy of what it was from the 50s. So that at least told us a little bit of like where he served and who he served with. But other than that, we don't have anything else besides that.
Before we talk about Charlie Peete's time with the Cardinals, I want to highlight something that you already mentioned, and that is Jackie Robinson, who was the first black ball player to integrate Major League Baseball. He did that with the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. So this is close to a decade before Charlie Peete was called up with the Cardinals. Now, after Jackie Robinson's playing career, he had said that he had experienced mistreatment from several teams, including the Cardinals. What was it specifically about the St. Louis Cardinals that made it an unwelcoming environment?
There's a lot of different theories, and of course, at the time, pretty much every team at the time, Robinson experienced a lot of mistreatment from the Cardinals. Though were kind of a more high-profile team, and there were some theories. The team had a lot of players from the South, the segregated South, and I should say maybe to their credit, as they got older, they began to renounce some of the views that they had earlier in life, and talked about how it was a mistake. But the Cardinals were embroiled in a very high-profile situation that's debated to this day, actually, what the true facts of it were. But there was some inkling, reportedly, that they were planning to organize a strike against Jackie Robinson, basically a work stoppage in 1947, saying that they would not play to protest his entrance into the major leagues and the desegregation of professional baseball. It was unclear how organized it was or how many players were involved. We know that Stan Musial was one that was not involved involved, and was one that, although there was some criticism that maybe he could have done more, Musial was always very much on the forefront and as a more progressive member of the team, and was always held in very high regard by the African American players, both in the league and on the Cardinals. But that incident with the team, where it was, the rumors that they were striking, which again is debated to this day, and you can go back and forth for really forever about what the truth is. But it really stained the Cardinals' reputation, along with some other incidents, some brush-ups they had with Robinson, that really kind of really soiled the reputation of the Cardinals. But I think more so the owner in the late 40s and early 50s was a man named Fred Tsai, who was just adamantly opposed to the integration of baseball, and basically said that. And so you actually had the NAACP in St. Louis that protested, and at one point in the early 50s said that if there were not steps taken to integrate, like other teams in the league had done, that they were going to organize boycotts of the game in the early 1950s. And so, as we can talk about it in a little bit, when August Bush and Anheuser-Busch take over ownership of the team in the mid-50s, in 53 and beyond, that's when we start to finally see steps toward integration. But when it came to Jackie Robinson in the late 40s, he just had some brush-ups with the Cardinals, with other teams as well, but with the Cardinals it was just more high profile, and perhaps because you did have a lot of players from the Jim Crow South that just had those discriminatory and racist attitudes, to be frank.
And I think it's worth mentioning that St. Louis was the southernmost city that had a Major League Baseball team at the time.
Yes, yeah, and that was why the owner, Fred Tsai, he used that as a justification, saying, well, because we draw fans from Texas and Arkansas and Alabama, KMOX signal was obviously so powerful and still is, that he said, well, it's not a good business move, which of course we all know is a very weak justification for upholding segregation, essentially. But that was the explanation that he had given, and St. Louis, of course, at the time was in a lot of ways a city with a lot of Southern attitudes.
I'm talking with Danny Spewak, author of Cardinal Dreams, The Legacy of Charlie Peete, and A Life Cut Short. We'll be back in just a moment, and we'll talk about Charlie Peete's call-up to the Cardinals. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back. I'm Alex Hoyer. I'm talking with Danny Spewak, author of Cardinal Dreams, The Legacy of Charlie Peete, and A Life Cut Short. Charlie Peete is not the first black player to play for the Cardinals. That distinction goes to a man named Tom Alston, who played for the team in 1954. We've already mentioned that Charlie Peete gets a midseason call-up to the Cardinals in 1956, but I want to go back a little bit before then. How does Charlie Peete's affiliation with the Cardinals begin?
That's also a very interesting question in the way this all came about. When he came back from the Korean War, he went back to his hometown of Portsmouth, and the world had changed. By the time the Korean War was over, the world, even in the South, had changed, and he was actually one of the forefront of the players that helped integrate that Class B minor league that he had previously been, having to sit in segregated seats when he was a kid going to watch those games. Well, now the Portsmouth team in this Piedmont League in Virginia was now integrated, and he helped integrate it, and he was still very well known for that among many of the former players that remember that league to this day. And so he becomes an all-star in this Piedmont League, which to try to give you a little bit of a context for baseball fans, like it's probably like the equivalent of like a single or double A now, like the Springfield Cardinals kind of. Mm-hmm. Portsmouth didn't have an affiliate, but a lot of teams that they played against were like Yankees affiliates or Dodgers affiliates. So these were a couple of steps below the majors, and Peete became an all-star in 53 and 54 and is starting to draw major league interest. And it's not quite known exactly how he gets on the Cardinals' radar, but his owner in Portsmouth, the owner of the team, the Portsmouth Merrimacs, had a pretty good relationship with the Cardinals. Actually, Brooks Lawrence, who you mentioned, had played for the Portsmouth team. And it's and also Pete's manager at one point was Pepper Martin, who was a kind of a famous name in Cardinals lore
from the Gas House Gang, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes, a very famous name, of course, in St. Louis history. He was a manager in the 50s for Peete. So we don't know exactly, did he make a phone call and say, hey, you guys should take this guy, or maybe just his talent just shined. So the Cardinals select him in basically like a minor league draft in in the late 1954, and he's a budding prospect, and they send him straight to AAA. So he goes to the highest level of the minor leagues, just one notch below the majors. And there was two AAA affiliates with the Cardinals. First, the Rochester, New York Red Wings, which are still around today, and then there was the Omaha, Nebraska Cardinals, who are another AAA team, and he split time there in '55, but went straight to AAA, which I think shows his talent and his potential.
And it was also during that time that the Cardinals had a pretty robust scouting system. I even think the Cardinals, if I have it right, really kind of they were the model for how modern scouting worked. Is that right? Mm-hmm.
Yes, it was Branch Rickey, who was, of course, probably more well-known in baseball for being the one who brought Jackie Robinson into Brooklyn, but he was actually, before that, was the Cardinals general manager. And in the 20s and 30s, he was very famous for really kind of modernizing that system of having minor leagues. And so, yeah, the Cardinals had a really robust scouting, and they had scouts that operated in Virginia and Maryland and that kind of thing. So we're assuming that's how they found Peete. And Peete was such a good player. He was very well-known, too, in his league. He was all over the newspapers, so he wasn't really a hidden talent. If you just had somebody watching him, he was like one of the better players in the league. And so it was that scouting system that we were sure probably put him on the Cardinals' radar.
So Charlie Peete, highly touted prospect, and he is informed in July of 1956 that he's going to get a call up to the big leagues. What do you think that moment was like for him?
Well, it must have been just an incredible moment, a lifelong goal that was realized. He said that day that he would, he basically told the general manager of the Cardinals he plans to retire as a Cardinal. He wasn't going to just make this a come up and stay for one season. He saw this as his calling, and he was gonna be a great Cardinals player. And he said, I plan to retire here, and that he basically, we're not going to let you down. And he comes up and plays against the Pittsburgh Pirates at the old Sportsman's Park, which at that point had been renamed Busch Stadium under the new ownership, but we all call it Sportsman's Park. And that was his first game against the Pittsburgh Pirates, against Bob Friend, was the pitcher for Pittsburgh that day, and must have just been an incredible moment. And when I traveled to Virginia to do research for the story, I was able to get KMOX. The signal's incredible the way it goes. And I kind of think about, maybe his family and friends listening to the game and listening to Peete playing in St. Louis all those miles away and realizing a lifelong goal.
So at the time he's called up, I think his first plate appearance is a walk. What is the rest of that game like for him?
His first plate appearance, I believe, and it's funny, I wrote the book, so I should know this off the top of my head, but he was a pinch hitting appearance, and then he comes back the next day, and then he's basically kind of like, you would consider him like a platoon player, basically that he's playing part-time versus certain pitchers and that kind of thing. So other than, we know that he, when he had gone into the game in the outfield at the end of that first game, he had been a pinch hitter. His throwing arm had immediately caught the attention of everybody in the stadium. It was actually written about in, I believe, the Post-Dispatch, either that or the Globe Democrat, one of the newspapers, had said, the crowd made a noise when they saw him throw the ball for the first time. So that kind of, everybody gets excited when there's a new player on the field, and here was this rookie, throwing a rocket from center field, and the crowd was excited about it. And even back then, Cardinals fans, they know the game well, and they appreciated it.
He was also a great fielder. I mentioned at the top of this discussion that he only played 23 games, and he batted just 192. In fact, he would be demoted after a while, but he committed no errors in the field, which I think is important to mention. But I want to jump to, within those 23 games, he gets the chance to be a part of the same game on the same field as Jackie Robinson. And that seems remarkable to me. And I also wonder, based on what you came across, what kind of reaction that Charlie Peete might have had or how he felt. Do you have a window into that time?
That's another story that's been lost to history of what that must have been like, and that feeling of walking on the same field as Jackie Robinson. It was at Busch Stadium, Sportsman's Park, Robinson was in his final year as a major leaguer, so his legacy is in many ways already established, and of course will continue to be established. But he's coming in at the end of the game, and him and Pete finally playing on the same field. The only thing I can really say about the window into that is just you think about that it was almost 10 years earlier that Pete had tried out for Brooklyn with the Brooklyn organization back in Virginia. Him and his brother Jim actually, and a bunch of their teammates had gone just with aspirations of joining the majors, and it was really in many ways because of Jackie Robinson, who was so inspirational. There were so many other figures who helped desegregate professional baseball, but Jackie was just the one that was the name, and of course the first. So I wish we had more. The one thing that survived that Pete was able to really give a window into his life was a questionnaire that he gave in Cooperstown, that when he first came up into the majors, that he wrote a lot of his recollections of coming up to the majors. He had talked about how it was like, one of the best days of his life to come up in July of 1956. Then he got that phone call. And he talked a lot about Stan Musial being an idol of his. He didn't mention Jackie Robinson in any of those writings, but we can only imagine what an inspiration he must have been.
I'm talking with Danny Spewak, author of Cardinal Dreams, The Legacy of Charlie Peete, and A Life Cut Short. I do want to get to that life cut short part. It's the end of the 1956 season, and like many ball players do, especially when they're younger, when they're rookies, they go play ball elsewhere. And Charlie Peete was going to play winter ball in Venezuela, and that gets us to Flight 253, where we know that plane crashed. There were 18 people who died. But set up a little bit more about why he was specifically going to Venezuela to play ball.
Sure. So very common in those days for major league players during the offseason to go play in where it was a warmer climate. So they played, and still do, play baseball with their season in what we consider the winter down in Latin America. He had played the previous year for both a team in Cuba and Venezuela. And now in the offseason of 56, 57, so like November through February, he was planning to do that as well. And he actually he went to Cuba in that early fall of, October, early November of 1956. And unfortunately, he was cut from a really good Cuban team that just had a lot of really good players. So then he decides he's going to go play in Venezuela. Unfortunately, and this is probably one of the great tragedies of the story, it was this is just by chance. This isn't for any reason or intentional, but he decides to, instead of just going to Venezuela, to join his new team in the Winter League, he wants to go back home and actually gets his family, because they want to spend Thanksgiving, or they're at home in Thanksgiving, but they want to spend Christmas together in South America, because he had a young family. He had 3 young kids with his wife Nettie. So he decides to go back and get them, which is totally reasonable and understandable. He wanted to be with his family. But it's just a tragedy that just happened to be the reason why he was on that flight. Instead of just going to Venezuela, he goes to New York City first to fly out of JFK, which is, as it's now called. He goes to Virginia, then to New York, and unfortunately they're on that flight. So it's just just really sad the way that worked out, and that ended up being the flight that crashed.
What was the reaction like?
The reaction, it was an outpouring of grief among so many different places that he had played. I mean, he had it was just one of those things where he had played across the country. So the newspapers in Omaha, Nebraska, Rochester, New York, Portsmouth, Virginia, St. Louis, New York Times even, were front page news that there had been this plane crash, and this baseball player, professional player, Charles Peete, who was expected to be potentially the starting center fielder for the St. Louis Cardinals in 1957, that he and his wife and 3 kids are among the 25 victims that are killed in this plane crash, which was a big national and international story. Even was, of course, a huge story on the front page of the newspaper in Venezuela. Their main newspapers all covered it. It was a horrible tragedy. And there had been a couple of really awful plane crashes at that time. So it was a national crisis as commercial plane travel was starting to become more of a thing at that time. But it was an awful thing. Pete's the general manager of the Cardinals, Frank Lane, was the one who actually called Pete's family and didn't realize it, but he was informing them that he and Nettie and the kids had all been killed in the crash. And he wrote about that a little bit. That was documented in the newspapers, how hard of a phone call that was. And I think his quote was that it was beyond beyond baseball. It was just a horrible tragedy that he had lost his life along with the other victims. But from a baseball perspective, it was also just very sad because it left a really budding young player who maybe didn't hit that well as a rookie, but was widely expected to come back when he actually got full playing time to be a great player. That we never got to realize that potential.
I'm talking with Danny Spewak, author of Cardinal Dreams, The Legacy of Charlie Peete, and A Life Cut Short. We'll get back to this conversation in just a moment. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back. I'm Alex Hoyer. I'm talking this hour with Danny Spewak, author of Cardinal Dreams, The Legacy of Charlie Peete, and A Life Cut Short. Now, the loss of life is tragic just because there were lives lost. I mean, this is a family of 5, Charlie Peete, his wife Nettie, 3 young children. I mean, it is just gut-wrenching that this happened. From a baseball point of view, it was even more tragic because of the what-ifs. What would have happened to Charlie Peete? What would have been his contributions to the St. Louis Cardinals? As we mentioned, he was a highly touted prospect. He had already played with the big league club. He was expected to vie pretty seriously for the starting center field job. I think that would have made him the first everyday starting player who was black for the Cardinals. And so there are a lot of what ifs and what could have been, and I'm wondering how you tackled that question of what ifs and what could have been.
Well, it was a difficult balance because on one hand, when you write about a player and a subject, you maybe risk getting so close to it that I didn't want to present it as though he was for sure going to be a Hall of Fame baseball player because we just don't know. But the point is that he just never got even the chance to try. And so I think I try to take the approach that here was a really good prospect. And there's a lot of really good baseball prospects that come up every year. But here was a guy that everybody expected to be really good, had been really good his whole career. And so sad that he never got the chance to even prove it on the field. And so when I look at the context of the Cardinals, he came up in the 50s, so the mid-50s, kind of not a great period for the St. Louis Cardinals. It was, of course, the 60s when the Cardinals went to 3 World Series and won in 64 and 67. Both of those years they won the World Series. You think about Pete, he was on the forefront of integrating the franchise and in many ways set the, set the groundwork for the players that came after him that are so familiar to Cardinals lore. Bob Gibson, Lou Brock, Bill White, so many of these great players, Curt Flood, who all helped to really create a very unique and special team in the 1960s. And you think about Pete, he would have been a veteran. Let's just say he comes up and he's the starting center fielder in 57. He's playing into his 30s. He might be on those World Series teams. Johnny Keane, who was the manager of the St. Louis Cardinals for the 64 World Series team, was his manager in Omaha. So many different connections that I think he would have been a great player. Maybe would he have been in Cooperstown? I don't know, but I think he would have been a great player. Like one of those guys that right now, if you're thinking about Cardinals history, if he had lived, he might be that guy that you see at Busch Stadium and someone's wearing the vintage Pete jersey, So I think about that a lot. I think his talent level, he would have had a really good chance to be a starter and a great player.
You mentioned Curt Flood, and I think that's an interesting thought experiment. Curt Flood was a center fielder for the St. Louis Cardinals from 1958 to 1969, and he was a fantastic player who was not in the Hall of Fame, but he was a 3-time All-Star and a 7-time Gold Glove winner, and he has many contributions to the game. Among them is that he's famous for his lawsuit that challenged Major League Baseball's reserve clause, and it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and he lost that case, but it really paved the way for what we know as modern-day free agency. And we could do an entire interview about Curt Flood and his contributions, but it's kind of interesting to think about, had Charlie Peete lived and been the starting center fielder for the Cardinals in the late 50s, maybe the early 60s, would the Cardinals have even acquired Curt Flood? What do you think about that?
Yeah, and that's another one where we just will never know. But to provide some context, Pete was killed in the plane crash in November of '56. So then in 1957, the team basically didn't have a center fielder. So Ken Boyer, a great Cardinal, who was a third baseman most of his career, he moved to center field in '57 as just kind of a stopgap. But they didn't have a center fielder, so they went out and in the offseason after the '57 season, they go in, they trade for this young player named Curt Flood from Cincinnati, who had played infield, but they thought, well, maybe he could play center field because we don't have one. So it's hard to say, if Pete is playing center field and he's having a great season in 1957, he's never killed in that plane crash, does the team go out and get Curt Flood? Maybe. The Bing Devine, who was the new general manager at that time and was the architect of the 60s World Series teams, he made his first trade, and that was Curt Flood, and the manager, Fred Hutchinson, really liked him. So I go back and forth thinking, maybe there's a world where Pete's on the team and they still get Curt Flood and one of them plays infield or one of them plays right field instead of center field. And that's fun to think about. But, not to get too into the weeds of just kind of the baseball aspect, you just think about that. If the Cardinals never trade for Curt Flood and they have Pete as a center fielder and Curt Flood maybe stays in Cincinnati, does that set into motion this very, very historic part of baseball history that Curt Flood, very frustrated by the fact that in the late 60s he's traded by the Cardinals to the Philadelphia Phillies, and he doesn't want to go because he doesn't have the rights, because he is saying that Major League Baseball says you can only go to a place that the team tells you can't sign in free agency. You have basically no rights as a player. And initiating that Supreme Court challenge, a very landmark case that went against him, but opened that door to players becoming free agents eventually in the later 70s. He was just a landmark figure. I think should be in the Hall of Fame for what he did and the courage that it took, especially because it wasn't popular at the time. But of course, as we all know, as time goes on, people are starting to appreciate what Curt Flood did. You don't know. Would Pete have mixed up that whole scenario? And maybe does Flood do that legal challenge in Cincinnati? Who knows? We have no idea, but it is really interesting to think about. It's just kind of a part of baseball history that puts Pete into that context.
Yeah. I also want to return to something that you mentioned at the top of our discussion, which was the answer to how you became aware of Charlie Peete, and that was in 2014 because of the death of Oscar Taveras, who was a right fielder for the Cardinals, and he tragically died in a car crash in 2014 after the season in his native Dominican Republic. I was actually at his debut game at Busch Stadium on May 31st of 2014, and wow. It was against the San Francisco Giants, and I remember it very clearly. It was the bottom of the fifth inning, and it had just started to rain, and Oscar Taveras comes to the plate, and he belts a home run. And with the rain falling down, the score was 0-0 at the time. The Cardinals go up 1-0. They end up winning 2-0. But it was kind of one of those, and I'm sure you have these too, of going to baseball games. It was one of those magical baseball moments that you'll never forget, with the rain falling down, the home run happening. Mm-hmm. And I found myself thinking a lot about Oscar Taveras' death many decades after Charlie Pete's death, and I wonder how much you thought about that too.
Yeah, the parallels are very eerie. They played the same position. They're outfielder, left-handed batter with a lot of power. Really budding prospect, and then killed in like a almost similar transportation accident in a Latin American country. The parallels are just really striking, and I think it's just one of those things, too, where that awakened some of the stories of Charlie Peete. His name was printed a little bit, and Rick Hummel, the late, great Rick Hummel for the Post-Dispatch, had mentioned Peete because he knew of Peete firsthand. And that was mentioned in the newspaper that, it just kind of awakened those stories. And over the years, others have tackled the story of Peete in certain articles and things. But I think about the same thing. Oscar Taveras right now would be, how old would he be, in his 30s? His career would be in his, been in his prime. He might still be playing for the Cardinals, 10 years later. So with that same regard of just eerie similarities, it does make you think about that.
Why is it important to you for people to know who Charlie Peete was?
just the trailblazer he was in the Cardinals organization, and that he came at a time when, I mean, he was among the first maybe like half dozen African American players in the league, and so he's one of the first black players for the Cardinals, and he never got a chance to realize his full potential, but coming up through the minor leagues, he established so much for the Cardinals organization going into the 60s of those great teams, and then all the great players that came after him. I just think Cardinals fans should appreciate what Peete went through to get to that point. And even though he's not a name that people really know, I think he's a name that people should remember. And this was what was so interesting for me when I was writing the book. When I first gravitated toward the subject, I was talking a lot about the crash and a lot about the way he had died. And of course, that's a huge component of the story. But as I did more and more research, it just sort of dawned on me that his story wasn't just the way he died. It was really about all that he accomplished and coming through the Cardinals at that time and reaching the major leagues in the mid-1950s, coming from segregated Virginia. It was just a dream that maybe in 1929, when he was born in a small town in Virginia, may have seemed distant, but he accomplished it in his 20s and could have accomplished so much more. And I find that really interesting. And I thought that the event the Cardinals did when they played the Giants, San Francisco Giants, at Rickwood Field in Alabama, the historic place where so many great Negro League teams had played, I thought that was such a special event. And although Peete wasn't mentioned, a lot of the players from those great Negro Leagues teams were appreciated on that day, and the Cardinals got to be a part of it. And I know Mason Wynn talked about the current shortstop for the Cardinals, how special that was to be a part of that. And he's someone that really appreciates the history. I thought that was a special event that we should do more of that kind of stuff. Baseball fans should know where this game has been. Not a pretty picture in many ways, but where the game has been and the work that still needs to be done.
In terms of Charlie Peete's legacy, I did note, and you mentioned it in the book, that in Portsmouth, Virginia, where he grew up, there is a Charles Peete Little League, which bears his name, and it seems like a fitting way to honor Charlie Peete's legacy. What can you tell me about that Little League?
Yeah, this was one of the more special parts of the story. Peete is his name is not probably well known in many places, but the name Charles Peete in Portsmouth, Virginia, is very well known, and not necessarily because people even know the true story of who Peete was. But yes, in the 50s and in the 60s under segregation, they named Little League after Charles Peete. After his death was devastating to the black community in Portsmouth, he was such a great person and part of that community. They decided to carry on his legacy by naming a youth baseball league after him. And it was really the only league at that time for black players, for young black kids in that neighborhood, in segregation of the Jim Crow era, the tail end of the Jim Crow era in Virginia, to be able to play. And that league has persisted, and it is really, really famous now locally. A lot of actually professional athletes have come out of that, where they've grown up in Virginia. There's a NBA player who had played in there and is now playing in the NBA. Just a lot of different great athletes and players had grown up in that league, and to this day there's still the Charles Peete Little League field where you can go into Portsmouth, and I was able to talk to some of the organizers, and they still remember Pete's legacy, and they use the story every year when the spring begins and they do a parade to start with the new kids playing in the Little League. They always tell the story of who Charles Peete was, and so they know the name they're playing for. And I hope that story can be shared more widely too across the country.
You did a lot of research for this book. You mentioned that you traveled to Virginia, and you include a lot of notes in the book. Was there something about the research that you did that specifically surprised you?
Question. That's a really good question. Research that surprised me. I would say probably the maybe the importance of minor league baseball at the time. I'm sure there's other things that I could think about that surprised me, but when Peete was playing in the minor leagues, there were times when I was writing the book that I was like, do I have enough to even have a book here? Because it's just so hard. It's been so long. But finding a lot of the newspaper archives of his career when he was in Virginia or when he was in either Canada or in the Negro Leagues, and really talking more minor league baseball, I'm talking about the Cardinals affiliates, I guess, Omaha, Rochester, like his world, his story was told by so many different people because minor league baseball at the time was huge. And then, of course, when TV started to encroach on their territory, it was difficult to get more fans to come to the games. But he was really well known, and there was a lot of information about him from when he was specifically playing in minor league baseball that I found really interesting. And that was a whole world I didn't know a lot about, but it was starting to be fun for me to think about all those big crowds that would have watched those AAA teams in Rochester or Omaha, and a lot of future major leaguers. That was a fun aspect for me.
Danny Spewak is the author of Cardinal Dreams, The Legacy of Charlie Peete, and A Life Cut Short. Danny Spewak, thank you for being here today.
Alex, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here with you.
Today's episode was produced by our executive producer, Alex Hoyer.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.